Tonight, we will tell you a story not of heroes or ancient battles, but of something far more pervasive and, at times, strangely whimsical: the history of taxes. You will discover how governments across centuries and continents found the most unexpected things to levy, from the very air you breathed to the windows in your home, and even the beards on your face. You will learn why a simple pinch of salt could cost a fortune in one country, while in another, a hat might bear a special stamp of approval. We will journey through eras where the architecture of houses changed because of a tax, where personal grooming became a matter of state revenue, and where the most basic necessities became luxuries. This is a tale of human ingenuity, both in collecting and in avoiding, the strangest levies ever conceived. Oh, and if you enjoy these stories, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to the channel. New sleep stories are released here every day. All right, find a comfortable spot, let your mind wander to these peculiar corners of history, and allow the weight of the day to drift away. Our journey into the curious world of historical taxation begins in a vast and frozen land, with a ruler determined to drag his ancient kingdom into the modern age, even if it meant shaving the faces of his most traditional subjects. Our journey through the annals of peculiar financial levies begins in the vast, snow-swept lands of Russia at the dawn of the 18th century. It was a time of profound transformation, spearheaded by one of history's most ambitious and uncompromising rulers, Peter the Great. He was a czar, a supreme monarch of Russia, driven by an unyielding vision to drag his ancient, deeply traditional nation into the modern era, to align it with the flourishing technologically advanced powers of Western Europe. To Peter, Russia's traditional customs, its long flowing beards, and its deeply conservative ways were not merely cultural quirks. They were symbols of backwardness, obstacles to progress. He saw them as standing in the way of the Enlightenment and innovation he so desperately wanted to instill. In 1705, Peter the Great issued a radical decree that sent shock waves through Russian society: a tax on beards. For centuries, the beard had held immense cultural and religious significance in Russia. It was seen as a symbol of masculinity, piety, and an outward sign of one's Orthodox Christian faith. Many believed that shaving one's beard was an affront to God, an act of sacrilege that would prevent their very souls from entering heaven. Priests often preached that God created man in his own image, and that image included a beard. To remove it was to deface a divine creation. But Peter, with his iron will, saw only an antiquated custom that marked his people as distinct and, in his eyes, inferior to the clean-shaven gentlemen of Paris, London, and Amsterdam. He wanted his courtiers, his soldiers, and eventually all his male subjects to adopt the Western appearance, to look less like ancient patriarchs and more like contemporary Europeans. The tax was not a uniform levy. Its rate varied significantly depending on the social status of the beard's owner. Wealthy noblemen and merchants, those Peter expected to be at the forefront of his modernization efforts, faced the highest fees, sometimes up to 100 rubles a year, a substantial sum at the time. Middle-class citizens and city dwellers paid a lesser amount, while peasants, though still subject to the decree, faced a nominal charge, often just a single kopeck, whenever they entered or left a town. The sheer audacity of this tax Its direct challenge to deeply held beliefs made it one of the most controversial and memorable edicts of Peter's reign. Enforcement of the beard tax was as direct and uncompromising as Peter himself. Tax collectors, often accompanied by guards, were stationed at city gates and public places. Any man found sporting a beard was immediately confronted. If he paid the tax, he would receive a special copper or silver token, often inscribed with the image of an eagle and the words, "The beard is a superfluous burden," or "money taken." This token served as proof of payment, a kind of bearded passport that allowed him to keep his facial hair for the year. The token was a tangible, often cold and weighty reminder of the Tsar's decree, a small disk of metal that represented both defiance and submission all at once, a silent badge of conformity. However, if a man refused to pay or simply could not afford the tax, the consequences were swift and humiliating. The tax collectors, often armed with sharp shears or razors, would forcibly shave the offending beard on the spot. Imagine the scene. A man, perhaps a respected merchant or a devout peasant, surrounded by onlookers, his sacred beard, a symbol of his identity, roughly shorn away. The cold steel of the blade against his skin, the sharp snip of the shears, the sudden, shocking, and deeply personal loss of something so fundamental. It was a public spectacle designed to enforce compliance through profound shame and deep discomfort. These forced shaves were not gentle affairs. They were crude, often painful, and deeply traumatizing for those who held their beards dear. Many men, rather than endure such an indignity, simply capitulated and paid the tax, even if it meant significant financial hardship. The beard tax faced considerable resistance, particularly from the Old Believers, a conservative religious sect that had broken away from the official Russian Orthodox Church in the 17th century. For them, beards were not just a tradition. They were an integral part of their spiritual identity, a direct commandment from God. They viewed Peter's decree as an act of sacrilege, a direct assault on their faith and their very souls. Many Old Believers chose to flee to remote regions, enduring harsh conditions rather than submit to the Tsar's demand. Others simply refused to shave, risking public humiliation and even persecution. For them, the beard became a visible mark of their unwavering faith, a silent protest against the Tsar's modernizing agenda. The struggle over beards was, in essence, a struggle for the soul of Russia, a clash between ancient piety and radical modernity. This tax, though seemingly trivial, reshaped Russian society in profound ways. It forced a visual transformation, pushing the elite towards European fashion and creating a clear distinction between the modern and the traditional elements of society. It was a constant, visible reminder of Peter's absolute power and his determination to impose his will, even on the most personal aspects of his subjects' lives. The beard tax was eventually abolished after Peter's death, though its legacy endured as a potent symbol of his relentless drive for reform and the sometimes brutal methods he employed to achieve it. It stands as a testament to how deeply ingrained cultural norms can clash with the ambitions of a determined ruler, and how even something as seemingly innocuous as facial hair can become a battleground for power, tradition, and identity. From the peculiar customs of Russia, our journey now takes us west, to England, where a different yet equally strange levy was imposed not on a man's appearance, but on the very light that entered his home. In the year 1696, during the reign of King William III, a new tax was introduced, designed to raise much-needed revenue for the crown. It was called the window tax. You see, at this time, England was engaged in costly wars, and the government sought new, efficient ways to fund its military campaigns and state expenditures. A tax on windows seemed, at first glance, to be a remarkably simple and fair solution. It was thought that the number of windows in a house would directly correlate with the wealth of its inhabitants. A grand mansion would have many windows, and thus its owner would pay a higher tax. A modest cottage with only a few would pay less. It appeared to be a progressive tax, taxing the rich more heavily than the poor, without requiring intrusive inspections of personal income or possessions. The tax was structured in two parts: a flat rate per house and an additional charge for every window beyond a certain number, typically 10. However, the reality of the window tax proved to be far more complex and detrimental than its initial design suggested. What began as a seemingly ingenious method of taxation quickly led to unforeseen and often tragic consequences for the ordinary people of England, and indeed for the very architecture of the nation. Imagine, if you will, the immediate response of homeowners. Faced with an annual bill that directly increased with each pane of glass, many sought to reduce their tax burden by the most direct method available. They simply bricked up their windows. You can still see evidence of this today across England, in old buildings where former window openings are now filled with brickwork, creating blind, empty spaces on what were once bright facades. Sometimes the bricks matched the original, but often they were simply whatever was available, leaving a patchwork reminder of a bygone tax. This practice, while saving money for the homeowner, had profound and negative effects on the living conditions within these homes. Rooms that were once filled with natural light became dim, gloomy, and oppressive. The simple pleasure of sunlight streaming through a window, illuminating a living space, became a luxury. The air inside these sealed rooms grew stale, thick, and stagnant. Without proper ventilation, the natural flow of fresh air was severely restricted, trapping dampness and odors within the confines of the house. This lack of light and fresh air had a direct and significant impact on public health. In an era before modern medicine fully understood the causes of disease, the consequences were dire. Diseases like rickets, a bone-deforming condition caused by a lack of vitamin D, became more prevalent, especially among children whose developing bodies desperately needed exposure to sunlight. Tuberculosis, a highly contagious respiratory illness, also thrived in these dark, poorly ventilated environments, spreading more easily between family members living in close, confined quarters. The very homes that were meant to be sanctuaries became breeding grounds for illness, all in an effort to avoid a tax. The wealthy, of course, could afford to pay the tax, and their grand estates continued to boast numerous expansive windows, allowing light and air to flow freely. But for the working classes, for the artisans and shopkeepers and laborers, the choice was stark. Pay a crippling tax that might consume a significant portion of their meager income, or sacrifice the very light and air essential for health and well-being. Many chose the latter, leading to widespread discomfort and contributing to a general decline in the health of the population. Architects and builders also adapted to this peculiar tax. When constructing new homes, they would often design buildings with as few windows as possible, or at least fewer than they otherwise would have. This led to a distinct shift in architectural styles, with an emphasis on solid walls and limited openings, fundamentally altering the aesthetic of English towns and cities. You can observe the impact of this tax even now in older buildings, where the careful observer might notice an unusual scarcity of windows, or the presence of those telltale bricked-up openings, a silent testament to the taxman's reach. The window tax remained in effect for a remarkably long time, enduring for over 150 years. Generations lived under its shadow, adapting their homes and their lives to its demands. But as the 19th century progressed, and as understanding of public health improved, the detrimental effects of the tax became increasingly evident and widely criticized. Medical professionals and social reformers began to speak out against it, highlighting its contribution to disease and squalor. The argument that light and air were not luxuries but fundamental necessities for human health gained traction. Finally, in 1851, after years of debate and growing public pressure, the window tax was officially repealed. Its abolition was celebrated as a victory for public health and for the common good. While the immediate bricking up of windows ceased, the architectural legacy of the tax continued. Many of the bricked-up windows remained, and the design principles of minimizing window count persisted in some construction for a time, a lingering shadow of the tax that had once darkened so many homes. So, when you next walk through an old English town and you notice a building with an unusually blank facade, or perhaps a series of bricked-up arches where windows might once have been, you will know the silent story behind it. It is not a story of poor design, but of ingenious, if often harmful, tax evasion, and a reminder of how deeply the hand of government can reach into the very fabric of daily life, even shaping the way light enters a home. From the curious case of windows, we now journey to a substance far more ancient, far more essential, and in its taxation, far more cruelly enforced. Salt. For millennia, salt was not merely a flavor enhancer. It was a cornerstone of human civilization. Before refrigeration, salt was the primary means of preserving food, ensuring that harvests could last through winter, that fish could be transported inland, and that meat could be stored without spoiling. It was vital for health, for livestock, and for countless industrial processes like tanning hides and making glass. Its scarcity and necessity made it an ideal target for taxation, a practice that stretched back to ancient China and Rome. But nowhere was the salt tax more notorious, more deeply resented, or more intricately oppressive than in pre-revolutionary France, where it was known as the gabelle. This was not a simple levy. It was a state monopoly, a system designed to extract maximum revenue from a populace that could not survive without its product. The gabelle had roots dating back to the 13th century, but by the 17th and 18th centuries, it had evolved into a labyrinthine and brutal institution. The vast kingdom of France was divided into various regions, each with its own specific rules and rates for salt. This created what were effectively different salt districts. In some areas, salt was extremely expensive and its purchase mandatory, with each household compelled to buy a certain amount, regardless of actual need. This was known as the Great Gabelle region. Other areas enjoyed lower rates or even exemptions due to historical privileges or their proximity to salt marshes. This stark disparity in prices across short distances naturally fostered a thriving black market. The enforcement of the gabelle was relentless. A special corps of agents known as gabalists roamed the countryside, their authority absolute, their methods often ruthless. These were not ordinary tax collectors. They were dedicated to rooting out salt smuggling, a crime that ranged from peasants sharing a handful of salt with a neighbor to organized gangs moving large quantities across provincial borders. The gabalists were empowered to search homes without warrants, seize property, and arrest anyone suspected of evasion. The penalties for salt smuggling were horrifyingly severe, far out of proportion to the perceived crime. For minor infractions, individuals might face heavy fines, public humiliation, or even flogging. Repeat offenders, or those caught with larger quantities of illicit salt, faced imprisonment, branding, or the dreaded sentence of becoming a galley slave, condemned to a life of brutal labor rowing warships. Death by hanging was reserved for the most serious cases, particularly for armed smugglers or those who resisted arrest. Children were not exempt. They could be sent to correctional facilities or even the galleys for participating in salt smuggling. Families were often torn apart, their lives ruined, all for a substance as simple as salt. This system was not just an economic burden, it was a profound moral outrage to the common people. The gabelle represented the arbitrary power of the monarchy, the blatant inequality of the old regime, and the suffering inflicted upon the poorest and most vulnerable. It was a tax on life itself, making a basic necessity prohibitively expensive and turning ordinary citizens into criminals for trying to survive. The mandatory purchase, regardless of need, meant that many households were forced to buy more salt than they could use, effectively paying a tax on something they did not want or could not afford. The varying rates across regions meant that a peasant living just a few miles from an exempted area could pay 10 or 20 times more for the same amount of salt. The gabelle generated immense revenue for the crown, but at an incalculable cost in human suffering and public resentment. It was a constant source of friction, a daily reminder of the injustices of the Ancien Regime. The sheer number of convictions for salt-related crimes was staggering, filling prisons and galleys with people whose only transgression was trying to acquire a basic commodity without being fleeced by the state. When the storm clouds of revolution began to gather in the late 18th century, the gabelle stood out as one of the most hated symbols of royal oppression. It was frequently cited in the cahiers de doléances, the lists of grievances drawn up by the French people for the Estates General. The abolition of the gabelle was one of the earliest and most popular demands of the revolutionaries, a clear signal of their desire to dismantle the old unjust order. In 1790, the National Assembly, in a sweeping act of reform, finally abolished the gabelle, bringing an end to centuries of state-sanctioned misery. The end of the salt tax was met with widespread jubilation, a tangible sign that a new era of liberty and equality was truly dawning. It was a small, seemingly simple commodity, but its taxation had been a heavy yoke, a constant source of suffering, and a powerful catalyst for the revolutionary fervor that swept through France, forever changing its destiny. The story of the gabelle serves as a stark reminder of how deeply an unfair tax can penetrate the fabric of daily life, shaping not just economies, but the very course of history. As the 18th century progressed, the British government found itself in a constant struggle to finance its various endeavors, particularly its extensive military engagements across the globe. Wars, though often fought far from the quiet English countryside, demanded immense financial resources, and the search for new streams of revenue was ceaseless. After taxing windows and hats, the gaze of the exchequer turned towards another fundamental aspect of daily life, something so ubiquitous and seemingly mundane that its taxation might appear quite absurd: bricks. In 1784, a new levy was introduced in England, known simply as the brick tax. Its purpose was straightforward: to raise money for the national coffers, which had been significantly depleted by the recent American War of Independence. At first glance, taxing bricks might not seem as intrusive as taxing the light that entered one's home or the hat one wore on their head. Bricks were, after all, merely building blocks, fashioned from earth and fire. Yet they formed the very fabric of towns and cities, the walls of homes, the foundations of factories, and the chimneys that released the smoke of industry. The tax was applied at a rate per 1,000 bricks, meaning that every new structure, every repair, every extension would contribute to the national debt. The immediate consequence of this tax was a noticeable increase in the cost of construction. Builders and homeowners alike faced higher expenses, which in turn affected the affordability of housing and the pace of development. The red clay, once a cheap and abundant material, now carried an invisible, heavy burden. But human ingenuity, often spurred by financial pressure, soon found a way to mitigate this new cost. The tax was levied per unit, per individual brick. It did not, however, specify a maximum size for these units. And so, a simple yet profound shift in manufacturing began. Brickmakers, quick to adapt to the new economic reality, started producing bricks that were significantly larger than the traditional standard. If a house could be built with fewer, albeit bigger, bricks, then the overall tax burden would be reduced. Why use two smaller bricks when one larger brick could do the same job and only incur half the tax? This seemingly minor loophole led to the widespread adoption of what became known as jumbo bricks, or king bricks. Imagine the brickyards of England during this period, the air heavy with the smell of damp earth and wood smoke, the steady rhythm of hammers and molds. Now, the molds were being reshaped, enlarged, to create these new outsized blocks. The workmen, accustomed to the familiar dimensions, would have adjusted their techniques, lifting and laying these heavier units. The brick kilns, normally producing uniform batches, now turned out these larger, more substantial pieces. This change had a tangible impact on the appearance of English architecture. Buildings constructed during the era of the brick tax often feature noticeably larger bricks, giving them a distinct, sometimes heavier, aesthetic. The fine, delicate lines that could be achieved with smaller, more numerous bricks were replaced by a more robust, perhaps even cruder look. The subtle patterns and intricate detailing that smaller bricks allowed in brickwork became less common. Instead, walls appeared more monolithic, composed of fewer, more dominant elements. It was a visual testament to an economic policy. Beyond aesthetics, there were practical considerations. Larger bricks required more skill to lay correctly, as their weight and bulk made them more cumbersome. Mortar joints, the binding material between the bricks, also became a more critical factor, needing to be stronger and more carefully applied to support the heavier load. In some cases, the quality of construction might have suffered as builders wrestled with these new dimensions, or sought to cut corners in other ways to offset the increased material cost. The tax also subtly influenced the choice of building materials in certain regions. Where stone was readily available and cheaper than taxed bricks, its use might have been encouraged. In areas rich with timber, wooden structures might have seen a slight resurgence, at least for smaller dwellings or outbuildings. However, for much of England, particularly in urban and industrializing areas, brick remained the material of choice, and so the tax's influence was widespread. For 66 years, the brick tax remained in force, shaping the very homes and streets of England. It was a constant, subtle pressure on every builder, every homeowner, and every brickmaker. It was not until 1850, almost 3/4 of a century after its introduction, that the tax was finally repealed. By then, the Industrial Revolution was in full swing, and the need for affordable housing was paramount. The abolition of the brick tax helped to reduce building costs and facilitated the rapid expansion of towns and cities that characterized the Victorian era. The legacy of the brick tax can still be seen today if you know what to look for. Walk through older parts of English towns, especially those built in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, and you might notice the larger, more imposing dimensions of the bricks in certain walls. It is a quiet reminder of a time when even the most basic elements of construction were subject to the whims of taxation, and how human ingenuity, faced with such impositions, found ways to adapt, even if it meant reshaping the very fabric of their world, brick by brick. The late 18th century, specifically the year 1784, found Great Britain in a familiar position, in need of money. The American War of Independence had concluded a year prior, leaving the national coffers significantly depleted. Governments then as now sought various means to replenish their funds, and often their gaze fell upon everyday items, things so common that almost everyone used them. One such item, a staple of both fashion and practicality, was the hat. And so, the British Parliament, under the leadership of Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger, introduced the hat tax, a measure aimed at generating much-needed revenue for the Crown. This was not a simple, flat fee, universally applied. Instead, the tax was cleverly designed to be progressive, meaning it varied according to the retail value of the hat itself. For hats costing less than 4 shillings, the tax was a relatively modest 3 pence. If your hat was priced between 4 and 7 shillings, a sum that would buy you a decent felt or straw hat, the tax rose to 6 pence. And for any hat valued at more than 7 shillings, perhaps a finely crafted beaver hat or an elaborate tricorn, a full shilling was added to the price. This system aimed to ensure that the wealthier members of society, who could afford more expensive headwear, contributed a larger share to the national revenue. It seemed, on the surface, a fair and reasonable approach, tapping into the visible displays of social status. To enforce this new levy, a system of special stamps was introduced, similar to those already in use for other taxed commodities of the era, such as playing cards or newspapers. Every legitimate hat sold within the kingdom was legally required to bear one of these distinct government stamps, clearly indicating that the appropriate tax had been paid. Without this stamp, the hat was considered illegally sold, and both the hat manufacturer or seller and the individual purchasing it could face penalties. Hat retailers were obligated to purchase these stamps from the government and meticulously affix them to their products before they could be offered for sale. This was meant to be a foolproof method of collection, a clear visual sign of compliance, ensuring that every hat passing through official commerce contributed its due. The stamp was, in essence, the hat's legal birth certificate, proving its contribution to the crown and its legitimacy on the market. However, the ingenuity of the British public, when faced with a new tax, proved to be a formidable adversary. People, then as now, were remarkably adept at finding loopholes and devising creative strategies to avoid paying what they considered an unfair imposition. The hat tax, despite its seemingly robust enforcement mechanism and the visible presence of the official stamp, was no exception. The streets and marketplaces soon became stages for a quiet battle of wits between the taxman and the everyday citizen. One common tactic involved the simple reclassification of headwear, a subtle but effective linguistic maneuver. A hat was clearly defined in the statute, but what if your head covering was not, in fact, a hat? Many individuals began to refer to their headwear as caps or bonnets, even if these items functionally served the exact same purpose as a hat, providing warmth, protection from the elements, or simply a fashionable accessory. The legal definition of a hat became a subject of great debate and considerable amusement in drawing rooms and taverns alike. If you could successfully argue that your head covering was not in fact a hat in the eyes of the law, then you were, by definition, exempt from the tax. This led to a proliferation of ambiguously named headwear, designed specifically to confuse tax collectors and delight their wearers with the cleverness of their evasion. A simple piece of cloth, artfully stitched, could become a cap, while still resembling a small brimmed hat, skirting the tax with a wink and a nod. Another widespread method of evasion centered around the value-based nature of the tax itself. Since the tax rate increased with the price of the hat, people quickly discovered a way to circumvent this progressive aspect. They would purchase inexpensive, unstamped hats, or hats that were so cheap they fell below the lowest tax threshold, often for just a few pence. Then, after the initial low-taxed or untaxed purchase, they would adorn these plain, basic hats with elaborate trimmings, rich ribbons, exotic feathers sourced from distant lands, and gleaming buckles. A simple, cheap hat, made of felt or woven straw, could thus be transformed, at home or by an independent tailor, into a truly fashionable, expensive-looking accessory. But crucially, the tax had already been paid on its initial low value, or perhaps avoided entirely, if it was sold without a stamp as a cap from the outset. This practice effectively circumvented the progressive aspect of the tax, allowing individuals to enjoy luxurious headwear without paying the corresponding levy that such an item would normally command. The fashionable streets of London, Bristol, and other bustling towns soon saw a curious array of seemingly modest hats that, upon closer inspection, were clearly worth far more than their declared or taxed value, a silent testament to public cunning. Furthermore, a thriving black market for unstamped hats inevitably emerged. Dishonest hat makers and unscrupulous sellers, always eager to profit from a loophole, would produce and distribute hats without the required government stamp. These unstamped hats could then be sold at a significantly lower price, as they had not incurred the tax cost, making them highly attractive to the general public. Buyers, eager for a bargain in a time when every penny counted, were often willing to take the calculated risk, knowing that proving tax evasion on a personal item, once it had left the point of sale, was exceedingly difficult for authorities unless they were caught in the very act of purchase. This underground trade, operating in the shadows of the legitimate market, severely undermined the government's efforts to collect revenue, making the tax increasingly inefficient and challenging to control. The very nature of hat manufacturing also presented a significant challenge to comprehensive taxation. Many people, particularly in rural areas or among the working classes, traditionally made their own hats, either for personal use or for local, informal trade within their communities. These homemade hats, by their very nature, would not pass through the official channels of established hat makers and sellers who were legally required to affix stamps. It was virtually impossible, and certainly impractical, for tax collectors to monitor and tax every individual who crafted a simple straw hat for protection from the sun or a knitted cap for warmth for themselves or their family members. This substantial segment of the population engaging in self-provisioning further eroded the tax base and made universal enforcement an insurmountable task. The hat tax, despite its initial promise as a reliable source of government revenue, ultimately proved to be cumbersome, inefficient, and remarkably difficult to enforce effectively. The widespread evasion, the clever reclassification of items, and the emergence of a robust informal market meant that the expected income never fully materialized in the national treasury. It became a source of public frustration and a quiet, everyday battleground, serving as a testament to the human spirit's enduring ability to adapt and circumvent regulations it deemed unfair or burdensome. The tax remained in place for several decades, a constant minor irritant, but its effectiveness waned significantly over time, a quiet reminder that even the simplest of items can become a complex arena for economic policy and public ingenuity. It was eventually repealed in 1811, a victim of its own impracticality and the public's relentless pursuit of tax avoidance. The era of the hat tax, like many other strange levies in history, faded into the past, leaving behind a legacy of peculiar fashion trends, a quiet sense of triumph for those who successfully outwitted the taxman, and a lesson in the unexpected consequences of taxing everyday life. As the Roman Empire expanded, so too did its needs, particularly its financial ones. The grand ambitions of emperors, the constant need to fund legions, build aqueducts, and maintain public services often led to creative and sometimes truly peculiar methods of taxation. While the English were busy taxing windows and bricks centuries earlier, The Romans had already pioneered some of the most unconventional levies known to history. And among these, perhaps none stands out quite as much as the infamous urine tax, introduced by the pragmatic Emperor Vespasian. Vespasian, who reigned from 69 to 79 AD, ascended to power after a tumultuous period known as the Year of the Four Emperors. He inherited an empire in significant financial distress, ravaged by civil war and mismanagement. A man of humble origins who valued practical solutions over aristocratic pomp, Vespasian was determined to restore Rome's coffers. He was known for his wit, his discipline, and his willingness to implement unpopular but effective measures. It was this unflinching pragmatism that led him to look at something as seemingly worthless as human waste and see a valuable resource, and thus a taxable commodity. The Roman Empire, particularly its bustling cities, had an extensive network of public latrines where citizens would relieve themselves. These facilities, while rudimentary by modern standards, were a common sight. What many might not realize is that the urine collected from these public conveniences was not simply disposed of. It was a highly sought-after industrial ingredient. This was because urine, especially stale urine, contains ammonia. In an era before modern chemicals, ammonia was invaluable for several key industries. One primary use was in the fulling process, a crucial step in textile manufacturing. Fullers were workers who cleaned, thickened, and bleached woolen cloth. They would often stand in tubs of urine, treading the cloth with their feet. The ammonia in the urine acted as a powerful cleansing agent, helping to remove grease and dirt from the wool fibers, and also contributed to the bleaching process, making the fabric whiter and softer. Imagine the scene: the rhythmic treading, the steaming water, and the distinct, pungent aroma that must have permeated the fulleries of ancient Rome. This was not a pleasant task, but it was essential for producing high-quality textiles that were then sold throughout the empire. Another significant application for urine was in the tanning of leather. Tanners used urine to soften and prepare animal hides. The ammonia would help to break down the collagen in the hides, making them more pliable and easier to work with, a necessary step before the actual tanning agents could be applied. Without these processes, the Romans would have lacked clean clothing and durable leather goods, both vital for daily life and for equipping their vast armies. Recognizing the economic value of this overlooked resource, Emperor Vespasian decided to levy a tax on the collection and sale of urine from these public latrines. This tax, known as the vectigal urinae, meant that anyone who wished to collect urine from public facilities, primarily the fullers and tanners, had to pay a fee to the state for the privilege. It was a tax on a raw material, a way to generate revenue from an existing, albeit unusual, industry. Predictably, this tax was met with derision and criticism, even from within Vespasian's own family. His son Titus, who would later succeed him as emperor, reportedly expressed disgust at the nature of the tax, finding it ignoble and beneath the dignity of the imperial office. He questioned his father's decision to derive income from such a foul source. In response to his son's disapproval, Vespasian is said to have held up a gold coin earned from the urine tax and asked Titus if it smelled bad. When Titus replied that it did not, Vespasian famously retorted, "Pecunia non olet," which translates to "money does not stink." This phrase has echoed through history, becoming a proverb that signifies that the origin of money is irrelevant once it has been acquired, or that profit can be made from anything, no matter how unseemly its source. Vespasian's urine tax, despite its controversial nature, proved to be an effective, albeit unusual, revenue stream for the Roman state. It highlighted his pragmatic approach to governance and his unwavering focus on financial stability. It also offers a fascinating glimpse into the ingenious, if somewhat unsavory ways in which ancient civilizations utilized resources that we might today consider mere waste. For the Romans, every aspect of life, even the most mundane, could be a source of income for the empire, and no potential revenue stream was too peculiar to consider when the imperial treasury needed filling. This tax, along with others, helped fund the construction of the Colosseum, a testament to Vespasian's ability to turn even the most unlikely sources into grand achievements. It was a tax that literally proved that money indeed had no smell. In the shadowed annals of history, there existed a tax far more sinister than any levied on beards or bricks. This was not a tax on possessions, but on existence itself, born from fear and greed during the grim era of witch trials in 16th and 17th century Germany. You see, the accusations of witchcraft, which swept across parts of Europe like a dark tide, were not always driven solely by religious fervor or genuine belief in dark magic. Sometimes a chilling economic motive lurked beneath the surface, transforming terror into a perverse form of revenue generation. Imagine a small German town, perhaps in a region like Franconia or Württemberg, where the air was thick with superstition and anxiety. Crop failures, livestock diseases, or sudden, inexplicable illnesses could plunge a community into despair. In such times, a scapegoat was often sought, and the weakest or most eccentric members of society became easy targets. An accusation of witchcraft might begin with a whispered rumor, a neighbor's ill will, or a simple misfortune attributed to malevolent forces. Perhaps an old woman living alone on the edge of the village was suddenly blamed for a child's fever, or a man with unusual knowledge of herbs was suspected when a harvest failed. Once accused, an individual faced a terrifying ordeal. The legal protections you might expect today were virtually non-existent. Trials were often conducted by local authorities, sometimes with the assistance of self-proclaimed witch-finders. Interrogations frequently involved torture, designed not to ascertain truth, but to extract confessions. The rack, the thumbscrew, or sleep deprivation could break even the strongest will, leading to admissions of impossible acts, often implicating others, thus perpetuating the cycle of accusation and terror. The accused, once confessed, faced an almost certain death sentence, usually by burning. But here is where the chilling financial reality emerges. The process of these trials, from the initial arrest to the final execution, was not free. There were costs for the judges, the bailiffs who apprehended the accused, the torturers, the scribes who recorded the confessions, and even the executioner. There was a fee for the wood for the pyre, for the ropes, and for the public crier who announced the sentence. These expenses, rather than being borne by the town or the state, were often meticulously itemized and charged directly to the accused. If the accused was found guilty and executed, their entire estate, their house, their land, their meager possessions, was confiscated. This confiscated property then became the primary source for covering all the trial expenses, with any remaining balance going directly into the coffers of the local lord, the municipality, or the church. Consider the stark implications of this system. In times of economic hardship, when resources were scarce and towns struggled to meet their financial obligations, the property of a condemned witch became a convenient, if horrific, source of income. A town council, facing an empty treasury, might find itself subtly, perhaps even unconsciously, incentivized to pursue more accusations. The more witches discovered, tried, and executed, the more property was seized, and the more the town benefited. This created a truly perverse incentive where justice was warped by the promise of financial gain. The very act of prosecuting a supposed witch could become a revenue-generating enterprise, turning fear into a commodity. For the victims and their families, the consequences were utterly devastating. Not only did they face the loss of a loved one to a brutal execution, but they also lost everything they owned. Children became orphans, often left destitute, with no inheritance or means of support. The social fabric of communities was torn apart by suspicion and distrust. Neighbors turned on neighbors, driven by fear, greed, or a desperate hope to deflect suspicion from themselves. The witch trials were not just a series of isolated events. They were a systemic horror, fueled by a complex interplay of religious fanaticism, social anxieties, and, in a deeply disturbing number of cases, outright financial opportunism. This practice was particularly pronounced in the fragmented political landscape of the Holy Roman Empire, where numerous small principalities, bishoprics, and free cities exercised considerable autonomy over their judicial system. Without a strong central authority to enforce uniform legal standards or curb local excesses, the temptation to exploit the property of the accused often went unchecked. While some enlightened rulers and legal scholars eventually began to question the validity of confessions extracted under torture and the very concept of witchcraft itself, the financial incentive played a cruel part in prolonging the dark era of the witch hunts. It cast a long, cold shadow over the lives of countless innocent people, proving that even in the pursuit of what was perceived as divine justice, human avarice could find a way to profit from profound suffering. The echoes of those trials remind us of the fragile line between perceived justice and outright exploitation, and how easily fear can be weaponized for gain. While the grim shadow of the witch tax darkened parts of Europe, across the Channel in England, another, far less violent but equally pervasive tax was quietly shaping the lives of its people. This was the candle tax, introduced in 1709. You see, for centuries, artificial light had been a precious commodity. Before the widespread advent of gas lamps and electric bulbs, the flickering flame of a candle was the primary, often only, source of illumination after dusk. It allowed for work, for reading, for social gatherings, for all the activities that extended beyond the natural cycle of the sun. But with the imposition of this tax, light itself became a luxury, reserved for those who could afford its inflated price, profoundly altering the very rhythm of daily existence for generations. The government, perpetually seeking new avenues for revenue to fund its many wars and burgeoning administration, saw candles as an easy target. Almost every household used them, from the grandest estates to the humblest cottages, making it a broad base for taxation. The tax was levied directly on the manufacture of candles, meaning that by the time they reached the consumer, their price had significantly increased, sometimes by as much as 20 to 30%. For the wealthy, this was a minor inconvenience, perhaps a slight adjustment to their household budgets, prompting them to perhaps use one less candle in a drawing room or extinguish lights in unused corridors. But for the vast majority of ordinary people, especially the working classes and the poor, for whom every penny counted, it beyond regulating the light of a candle or the size of a brick. Governments throughout history have also sought to influence the very fabric of society, extending their reach into the most personal aspects of life, marriage and family. Such was the case with the bachelor tax, a curious and often resented levy designed not to raise simple revenue, but to engineer social behavior, primarily to encourage marriage and increase population. The most famous and influential instance of such a tax emerged from the heart of ancient Rome under the iron will of Emperor Augustus. The Roman Republic, despite its vast conquest, had faced a quiet but profound crisis. Among the old noble families and indeed among the wider citizenry, marriage rates were declining and birth rates were alarmingly low. This was not merely a social concern, it was a matter of national security. Rome needed citizens for its legions, for its administration, and for its continued expansion. The traditional Roman values of family, duty, and procreation, once sacrosanct, seemed to be eroding. Augustus, who came to power after decades of civil war, saw himself not only as a political leader, but as a moral reformer, a restorer of the ancient virtues. He believed that a strong, stable Rome depended on strong, stable families. To this end, he introduced a series of groundbreaking and deeply unpopular legislative reforms. The first was the Lex Julia de Maritandis Ordinibus, enacted in 18 BC. This law mandated that men between the ages of 25 and 60 and women between 20 and 50 should be married. If they were not, they would face significant legal and social penalties. This initial law was followed and refined by the Lex Papia Poppaea in AD 9, which further elaborated on the obligations and penalties. These two laws, often referred to collectively, targeted two distinct groups, the Caelebs, who were unmarried men, and the Orbi, who were married couples who had not produced children. The penalties were not direct taxes in the sense of a financial payment to the state, but rather severe restrictions on inheritance and public life, which amounted to a significant financial and social disadvantage. For unmarried men, the consequences were stark. They were largely barred from inheriting property from anyone outside their immediate family, unless the will specifically stipulated otherwise, and even then, often only a fraction. Imagine a wealthy Roman, perhaps a distant uncle or a generous patron, leaving a vast fortune to his unmarried nephew. Under these laws, the nephew might find himself unable to claim the inheritance, or only able to claim a small portion, with the remainder reverting to the state treasury. This was a powerful incentive, as inheritance was a cornerstone of wealth accumulation and social mobility in Roman society. Furthermore, bachelors faced social disadvantages. They were often excluded from certain public festivals, denied preferential seating at the games in the Colosseum, and found it harder to advance in public office. They were subtly yet effectively marginalized from the full privileges of Roman citizenship. For the Orbe, married but childless couples, the situation was similarly restrictive. While they could inherit from their spouses, they were limited to receiving only half of any other legacies from outside their immediate family. The remaining half would once again be forfeited to the state. This provision was particularly harsh for couples who were unable to have children through no fault of their own. It created a quiet undercurrent of resentment, a feeling that the state was intruding into the most intimate aspects of their lives, dictating the very purpose of their union. Conversely, the laws offered significant incentives to those who complied and produced offspring. Fathers of 3 or more children, or 4 in Italy and 5 in the provinces, received special privileges, including accelerated career paths in public service and priority in seeking political office. Women who bore 3 children were granted the ius trium liberorum, the right of 3 children, which freed them from male guardianship, granting them greater legal independence and control over their own property. This was a revolutionary concept for Roman women, and it highlights Augustus's dual aim: to boost the population and to elevate the status of motherhood. The enforcement of these laws was not always smooth. They were deeply unpopular, particularly among the Roman elite, who valued personal liberty and often preferred smaller families or alternative arrangements. There were constant attempts at evasion. Fictitious marriages were arranged, sometimes with very young children, simply to fulfill the letter of the law and avoid the penalties. Divorces and remarriages were strategically timed to manipulate the legal provisions. Even Augustus himself, the great moral reformer, faced accusations of hypocrisy, having only 1 child from his marriage, and that child, Julia, became entangled in scandals that deeply pained him. Despite the resistance, these laws remained in effect for centuries, though their enforcement varied depending on the emperor and the prevailing social climate. They did not, however, achieve a dramatic increase in birth rates, especially among the upper classes, whose lifestyles often included later marriages and fewer children. The ingrained social norms proved more resilient than legislative decree. Yet, the bachelor tax and its associated laws marked a significant shift in the relationship between the Roman state and its citizens, establishing a precedent for government intervention in private matters with the aim of shaping demographic trends. This concept of taxing or penalizing the unmarried or childless was not exclusive to Rome. Throughout history, various societies have explored similar measures driven by different motivations. In medieval Europe, some towns or guilds imposed fines on bachelors, seeing marriage and family as essential for community stability and continuation. In more modern times, during the 20th century, some totalitarian regimes, such as Fascist Italy under Benito Mussolini, implemented bachelor taxes and offered incentives for large families, explicitly to boost population for military strength and national grandeur. Similarly, the Soviet Union, particularly after the devastating losses of World War II, introduced a tax on childlessness as part of a broader effort to rebuild its population. These diverse historical examples underscore a recurring theme: the belief that the state has a right, or even a duty, to interfere with individual choices about marriage and procreation, using the power of taxation as a tool for social engineering. The quiet pressure of these laws, whether through financial penalty or social disadvantage, aimed to guide individuals towards what the ruling power deemed the correct path, often with mixed results, but always leaving a lasting imprint on the lives of those who lived under their shadow. And now, as our journey through the curious annals of taxation draws to a close, let us consider a levy that, while seemingly trivial, managed to transform the very appearance of an entire nation. We turn our gaze to England in the late 18th century and the introduction of a peculiar charge known as the hair powder tax. The year was 1795. Great Britain found itself embroiled in a series of costly conflicts with revolutionary France, a period of immense strain on the national treasury. William Pitt the Younger, the then Prime Minister, faced the daunting task of finding new sources of revenue to fund these ongoing wars. It was amidst this financial pressure that a rather ingenious, or perhaps desperate, idea emerged: a tax on hair powder. To fully grasp the significance of this tax, you must first understand the prevailing fashion of the era. For decades, powdered hair had been not merely a trend, but an absolute sartorial necessity for the upper and middle classes, both men and women. It was a potent symbol of status, refinement, and wealth. Gentlemen, from the most esteemed peers to burgeoning merchants, adorned their heads with elaborate wigs or meticulously powdered their natural hair, often tied back in a queue or a pigtail. Ladies, too, embraced the fashion, their hair styled into towering coiffures, often augmented with false pieces, all liberally dusted with a fine white or off-white powder. This powder was typically a mixture of starch, often scented with lavender, orange blossom, or even iris root, giving the hair its characteristic pale, almost ghostly appearance. The ritual of powdering was a daily affair, a time-consuming and often messy process that required dedicated servants and considerable effort to maintain. The fashion dictated that one's hair should always present this artificial, pristine whiteness, a stark contrast to the natural hair color beneath. It was a look that spoke of leisure and a deliberate distancing from the grime and labor of everyday life. The hair powder tax was designed to capitalize on this pervasive habit. It was introduced as an annual levy of 1 guinea, a substantial sum at the time for anyone wishing to use hair powder. To comply, an individual had to purchase a special certificate each year proving their payment. This was not a tax on the powder itself, but rather a license to apply it to one's hair. The intent was clear: to raise revenue from a segment of society that could presumably afford such a luxury. However, the tax was not merely a fiscal instrument. It became an unexpected catalyst for a profound social and cultural shift. Its introduction coincided with a period of significant social upheaval and changing sensibilities, particularly influenced by the French Revolution. The lavish, often ostentatious powdered styles that had been so popular were increasingly associated with the excesses of the pre-revolutionary French aristocracy, a class that had been violently overthrown. As revolutionary ideals of simplicity, equality, and naturalness began to permeate British society, the elaborate, artificial powdered look started to fall out of favor. It began to be seen by some as old-fashioned, pretentious, and even politically suspect. The tax, therefore, did not merely add to the cost of a fashion. It provided a very practical and socially acceptable reason to abandon it altogether. Suddenly, an already inconvenient and expensive daily ritual became even more burdensome. Faced with the annual cost of 1 guinea, Many individuals, particularly those on tighter budgets or those who were already leaning towards more modern aesthetics, simply ceased to powder their hair. Why pay for a license to maintain a style that was already losing its appeal? The collective decision to abandon hair powder was remarkably swift. Within a few short years, the fashion landscape of Britain was transformed. Men began to wear their hair shorter, unpowdered, often cut in styles inspired by classical antiquity or the more practical military cuts emerging from the ongoing conflicts. The queue, or pigtail, once a universal feature, rapidly disappeared. Women's hairstyles also underwent a dramatic simplification. The towering powdered constructions gave way to softer, more natural curls and ringlets, often worn high on the head, but without the heavy white dust. The decline of hair powder was so rapid and comprehensive that by the early 1800s, it had largely vanished from everyday life, becoming confined almost exclusively to very formal court occasions, or worn only by the most staunchly conservative and elderly individuals who clung to the vanishing customs of a bygone era. The hair powder tax therefore stands as a fascinating example of how a seemingly minor fiscal policy, designed primarily to generate revenue, can inadvertently act as a powerful agent of social change, effectively terminating a long-standing fashion trend and reshaping the visual identity of a nation. It illustrates how the practicalities of taxation can intersect with the fluid nature of human taste and societal values, leading to an unforeseen cultural revolution, all silently encouraged by a simple annual fee. And with that, our exploration of history's strangest taxes concludes, leaving you with the quiet thought of how profoundly and sometimes strangely the past has shaped the world we inhabit.